today's presentation, Meagan Baco is the Director of Communications at Preservation Maryland. Meagan has managed diverse public history projects for the organization, including those on labor history, women's suffrage and voting rights, and LGBTQ history. They are an inaugural fellow of the ARCUS Preservation Leadership Program and recently completed the Baltimore Planning Academy. So the last thing is please add any questions you have for Meagan in the Zoom chat box at the bottom. And after their presentation, we will get to as many as we can. And with that, take it away, Meagan.
Cool, thank you, Molly. Okay, so I'm gonna share my screen and my presentation. And Molly, give me a thumbs up when you can see my presentation full screen. Awesome. Thank you everybody for joining on Friday afternoon. Thanks for AIA and BAF and Baltimore Heritage for all that they do. And I can't believe that they've already done 15 of these, which means we've been in quarantine and hanging out on Zoom for lots of weeks together. So kudos to everybody who's still making time to learn something new. And I'm just really appreciative of the opportunity to tell people a little bit about what I've learned about women's suffrage over the last couple of years. So as Molly said, I'm Meagan. I'm the Director of Communications at Preservation Maryland. We're the first and foremost nonprofit working specifically on Maryland's public history, preserving the built environment, and also cultural landscapes. So this is just one of the awesome projects that I get to work on. I got to work on a labor history project with Nathan Denny's. I got to work on a LGBTQ history project using a lot of research from Baltimore Heritage. So really great pioneering and progressive organizations that are hosting us today. So Preservation Maryland has, like the rest of America and preservation organizations, has kind of kept an eye on what are we going to do for the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. And so in 2017, we teamed up with the Maryland Historical Trust and more recently the Maryland Women's Heritage Center to help get the word out, all as part of this like massive commemoration, both nationally at the National Park Service and also down to the local level. And I'm just learning so much along the way. So my presentation today is just one lens of this. I'm not the preeminent women's suffrage scholar. I am more than happy to share my two main resources, and they are the historical context statement by Casey Roan for the Maryland Historical Trust, which I believe is available at the MHT library. Amazing resource. And also more accessible, immediately accessible, is our Ballot and Beyond kind of mini exhibit and podcast series. So that's something we teamed up with. We've got about 20 episodes online right now, and we're going to be releasing a couple dozen more next week with another flurry of kind of women's suffrage stuff on the 26th. So now's a great time to check that out. This will just kind of wet your whistle for Maryland's suffrage history, and I wanted to make sure that people knew those resources because I am certainly not the expert, but I've learned a lot from them. So jumping in, Maryland has a complex legacy of women's voting rights. Our story begins in the 17th century with Margaret Brent. Margaret Brent was a Catholic woman of nobility. Lord Baltimore granted her land and the privilege that came along with it, except for perhaps the right to vote. So when Brent and her sisters established a estate in St. Mary's City called Sisters Freehold, and Margaret Brent is interested in voting as one of the rights that you have as a landholder. So in 1648, she petitions the assembly for the right to vote. The members of the assembly were shocked that a woman would even be, asking for such a thing. And in extreme retaliation, Brent was refused. She and the family and others were kind of lost political favor, and eventually kind of deteriorated the family and their wealth, and she spent the rest of her life in Virginia. Now, of course, Margaret Brent was not petitioning and saying, votes for women, right? She was talking very specifically about the rights of landholders. So not necessarily the first suffragist, but certainly somebody who's recognizing that there is inequality in America. So she is known for saying taxation without representation is tyranny. So that's something that Marylanders can take pride in. That is a statement that we certainly hear today and has become part of American political philosophy. So Margaret Brent is kind of just this great touchstone of the very beginning of this story. So when did the first woman vote in Maryland? I found some research and some comments that it was in 1900 that Annapolis granted women the right to vote in a special municipal bond election. Again, I don't have a ton of information on this. I do believe it was perhaps just for that one election, and I haven't seen too much else about it. So put it in the comments or do a little research and let us know, because we're all eager to know. There was another municipal election that happened in 1908, and that was in Still Pond on the Eastern Shore. So on election day in 1908, 3 women showed up at the polls of Still Pond. Still Pond was a farming village and actually wrote in its charter a guarantee that women taxpayers had the right to vote in all municipal elections. And I've got this great story from 1908. So 12 white women were registered to vote, 2 African-American women were registered to vote. And on the day of the election, 3 of the women, along with 72 men, showed up. The 3 women were Anna Baker Maxwell, Mary Jane Clark Howard, and Eliza Lily Derringer Kelly. And it, with some fanfare, at least covered in the local newspapers, and I pulled these directly from their Ballot Beyond story from local newspapers. Just gives you a little bit of tidbit of their personalities. Anna Baker Maxwell and Eliza Lily Derringer Kelly were prominent members of the community. Eliza, with the last name Derringer, of course, was the granddaughter of Henry Derringer, the Philadelphia gunsmith who invented the pocket-sized pistol. Who knew? And then my favorite, Mary Jane Clark Howard, a 69-year-old farmer's widow for 24 years and a mother of 10, told a reporter she felt foolish voting. She wasn't quite sure what to do, but she wanted to see what she had been missing. So there's a great story from Still Pond in 1908. So I do not know if these women went on to participate in the suffrage movement. I'd love to learn more about each and every one of them. So when there was a concerted national women's suffrage movement, of course, Susan B. Anthony was a part of it. And it started in earnest in the 1840s in New York State, where Susan B. Anthony was born and raised, and she spent most of her adult life in Rochester, New York, where you can go to her house, which is operated by the National Park Service as a museum. So what's her role in Maryland? Well, the Lyric Theater in Baltimore hosted the National American Women's Suffrage Association Convention in February 1906. The gathering convened thousands of suffragists from across the country for a program of speeches, prayer services, musical performances, and club meetings. At that meeting, attendees witnessed a very important milestone in the women's suffrage movement, the transition of leadership from the movement's founders to the next generation. Susan B. Anthony, who was elderly at the time, was in poor health, used her remarks to urge the assembled young women to carry on the movement. She passed away just a month later, 14 years before the 19th Amendment. Anthony plays such a substantial role in the current official record of the suffrage movement nationally. And there's just enough research that there's enough to kind of pull apart and to really compare. What do some historians think about her approach, or others, or how other historians or groups of people feel about it. And what a luxury to have just enough information to really have those kind of discussions. So the suffrage movement was highly segregated. Anti-suffragists and suffragists used racially biased, racist language to get their points across, and between fear and just used a lot of tactics that we're not all, unfortunately, unfamiliar with. So does this diminish Susan B. Anthony and other white suffragist legacy? Question mark. What is a boon is that we have enough historical documentation to have these conversations about women's suffrage and about the legacy about voting rights, women's rights, and equality in America. And is a great opportunity to say, just because 2020 will pass us by at some point, this is a great opportunity to continue this research. Another woman of great prominence to this complex story is Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. Harper was a published poet and author who had been born free in Baltimore in 1825 and campaigned around the country for temperance, abolition, and women's rights. She operated in that intersectional space for the fight for abolition and for suffrage. Women played an active role in advocating for the end of slavery, but faced both sexist and gender discrimination from their abolitionist peers, as well as from the general public. In response, and born out of that frustration, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott convened the first Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls, New York in July 1848, thus the beginnings of the national women's suffrage movement. But Frances Ellen Watkins Harper believed that it was the right time to keep those complex causes linked together and work for a broad push in equality. In 1866, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and Frederick Douglass formed the American Equal Rights Association to secure equal rights to all American citizens, especially the right of suffrage, irrespective of race, color, or sex. Harper found truth in that statement. That was how she felt about her approach to women's suffrage, and she was a member of the American Equal Rights Association. That unification of causes and people and diversity did not happen to a great amount, did not happen. Certainly racial tensions continued and would echo through the remainder of the women's suffrage movement and would basically dictate a separate course for white suffragists and Black suffragists. Watkins Harper helped found the American Women's Suffrage Association and served as vice president of the National Association of Colored Women, among many of her other civic and literary achievements. Watkins Harper died 9 years before the passage of the 19th Amendment. And as Harper stood in that kind of intersectional, perhaps uncomfortable space for some of us, we must remember that this was the reality of the history and of the times, and is as complex then as it is now, and that should be reflected in the historic record, especially as we are commemorating, not necessarily celebrating, not necessarily honoring. We have to commemorate, in truth, a lot of the different voices in the women's suffrage movement. A notable Maryland suffragist who has a fantastic story, she was right in the thick of things, was Mary Bartlett Dixon from Easton, Maryland. She was a leader in the suffrage movement and in her chosen field of nursing. Dixon graduated in the 1903 class from Johns Hopkins School of Nursing. She quickly made an impact in medicine, helping to establish the Emergency Hospital of Easton in 1906, an institutional body today, now known as the University of Maryland Shore Medical Center in Easton. She was a leader in the Talbot County Charter of the Just Government League, one of Maryland's largest and most active suffrage organizations. She wrote regularly for the Maryland Suffrage News, and she edited a regular column for the Baltimore Sun entitled "What the Suffragists Are Doing." And there she is on a suffrage float in Talbot County. Fantastic picture, although blurry. In 1913, Dixon was one of just a handful of women who met with President Woodrow Wilson shortly after his inauguration and asked him to support a constitutional amendment enfranchising women. He didn't do it at that time. But when he was reelected in 1916, suffragists took their fight straight to the doorstep of the White House. In January of 1917, the National Woman's Party began a daily picket of the White House, holding banners with messages such as, "Mr. President, how long must women wait for their liberty?" These silent sentinels, as they were known, were some of the first people to ever picket the White House, and they pioneered an enduring form of political activism. If you headed down to DC today, be surprised if you didn't see any sentinels for one cause or another. Several of the days in front of the White House were themed either by state or by other cause. And Maryland suffragists being close to the action in DC, I imagine the phone tree lighting up and Maryland suffragists getting down there as needed and to help and to stand there in silence and in protest. Mary Bartlett Dixon defended the silent sentinels in the face of widespread public condemnation. So to me, I'm like, look at these banners. This is great. This is what I would be doing and I should probably be doing more of. And it didn't necessarily come across as a positive to certainly the public, men, other women. There were many female anti-suffragists. And so Dixon defends what the Sentinels are doing. when she writes to the Baltimore Sun in 1917, and she says, "The silent Sentinels are not annoying the president. He realizes that they are a gentle reminder of his inconsistencies. It is unthinkable that President Wilson can proclaim to the world his belief in the American principle of equal rights for all and continue to exclude, in his great leadership, equal rights for the women of the United States." The pickets became even more unpopular when the US entered World War I, after which their actions were seen as treasonous and simply distasteful. In the summer of 1917, police began arresting and imprisoning many of the political protesters. Mary Bartlett Dixon joined in the White House pickets on November 10th, 1917, and was arrested along with 40 other women. Mary is third from the left in this photograph. Several Marylanders in this occasion and others were imprisoned in the Occoquan workhouse, now the Loren Correctional Complex, where guards subjected the suffragists to brutal physical treatment, extended solitary confinement, and when the women were denied status as political prisoners, they went on a hunger strike, and some were eventually violently force-fed. In the swiftly changing court of public opinion, this widely publicized abuse of the women and imprisonment shifted the public opinion back in the suffragists' favor. In January of 1918, President Wilson finally felt sufficiently pressured to declare his support for a federal women's suffrage amendment, beginning the process that would lead to ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920. Suffragists knew that they had to keep their cause in the public eye in order to make their case, in order to elicit discussion, and hopefully bring people to their side of women's suffrage. Many suffragists were inspired by Alice Paul and General Rosalie Jones, who were themselves influenced by Emmeline Pankhurst, who was a militant suffragette, as they were known in Britain. Women increasingly began to use their physicality to draw media attention, holding swimming competitions, mountaineering, suffrage pilgrimages, and hikes. Suffrages on a pilgrimage would walk or hike a route that would allow them to stop and speak in many small towns, the spectacle of which women walking down the street with banners, out in public with a group of their friends, waving their flags, would certainly rise to the level of curiosity for many people, and would come out and talk to the hikers. Organizers knew that this would be a successful way to get media coverage and to talk directly with people in more rural communities than they would otherwise be able to reach. In Maryland, this idea of a very physical outdoor public appearance came to fruition in Maryland thanks to Lola Carson Trax and Edna Story Latimer. In June of 1914, Trax and Latimer led a group of Just Government League activists on a two-week hiking campaign through Garrett County. Their route began in Cumberland with stops in Grantsville, Friendsville, Oakland, and many communities in between. Hikes were also carefully planned to recruit new supporters. Trax explained in the Maryland Suffrage News, I gotta get a subscription to that thing. It seems to be where all the good information is. That as the hikers drew curious audiences, each woman would be assigned a role. 2 would hand out literature, 2 would hand out membership cards, and everyone would speak in turn. This is a highly produced hike. I'm sure there were off-the-cuff exchanges, pleasant and otherwise, but incredibly thoughtful pieces of political performance here, certainly. So this suffrage hike by Trax and Latimer proved to be very successful, and that hike in Garrett County earned the Just Government League over 800 new members. This experience also had quite an impact on the individual women, of course, previously socially confined in the private sphere. Weeks spent hiking in the mountains was a major departure from the day-to-day that they otherwise would have kind of been born into through their sex and gender. And it seems like a whole hell of a lot more fun, no? So Latimer began to believe in both the political and the personal growth through these hikes into breaking out of that private sphere. And she's quoted as saying that she believed the fascination of being out under the blue sky, to hear the birds singing, to see the beauty of nature, and that feeling of fellowship that exists among us all were enormous benefits for women who had never spent much time or had the opportunity to spend much time in outside pursuits. The car caravan is also a very specific type of political parade popularized by suffragists. And I have to show these photos from one of my favorite places in Maryland, which is Hyattsville. On July 31st, 1913, the National American Women's Suffrage Association chose Xantiger's Park in Hyattsville in Prince George's County as the rallying point for its motorcade to Washington, D.C. Research is ongoing to try and pinpoint where this is, where these ball fields and bandstands were. It could be near the recently demolished WSSC building. It could be near what is now known as Magruder Park and is currently going through some development pressures. So there's research going on there. And certainly if you have any ideas or resources, let me know. So more than 60 women drivers and hundreds of supporters arrived in Hyattsville between 10 a.m. on the morning of the rally, their cars flying flags and pennants announcing each delegation. Mayor Harry Shepard welcomed the guests and presented National American Women's Suffrage Association Executive Director Mary Ware Dent a key to the city. And Alice Paul, then Legislative Committee Chair of the organization, spoke to the enthusiastic crowd. The motorcade assembled and then proceeded to the US Capitol, carrying 85,000 signatures from across the country. And here they are arriving in Washington, D.C. So who were these suffragists? How were they recruited? How did they become part of this? Obviously, we've heard great stories about some women, and one of the major sources of suffragists were from existing or new social clubs. This photo happens to be from a St. Louis suffrage group, but it's just what I imagine suffrage meetings are like. We've all been in preservation advocacy meetings like this, have we not, or our neighborhood meetings? So a common source for suffragists were, for suffrage organizing membership and sustained support came from social groups. In the mid to late 19th century, American women formed thousands of social groups dedicated to self-improvement through literature, arts, and culture. Clubs and civic organizations fostered women's leadership and organizing abilities. Some club women embraced the suffrage movement as the next natural step. These groups were largely segregated. White and Black women in Baltimore formed numerous and mostly separate women's clubs in the late 19th and 20th centuries. Both addressed some similar community issues, things such as improved schools, child care for working mothers, housing and medical care, and poverty. In addition to these concerns, club women in Baltimore's African-American neighborhoods also grappled with the threat of Jim Crow laws and the city's adoption of the nation's first residential segregation ordinance in 1910. Gradually, many social clubs turned from inward-facing social groups to activist organizations and to suffrage organizations. One of the first suffrage-specific groups to form in Maryland was in Sandy Spring in Montgomery County. In 1889, Carolyn Hallowell Miller organized her Sandy Spring Quaker community, and in 1894, the Baltimore Suffrage Club was founded, both of which later merged into the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Known as a historically progressive community, Sandy Spring, Maryland served as the base of operations for some of Maryland's suffragists and the movement. Between 1883 and 1915, Maryland Women's Suffrage Association President Miller, pictured there, and future President Mary Bentland Thomas helmed statewide campaigns for women to gain the right to vote. Of note here, it's what I've learned from, again, Casey Roan, who wrote the context statement for Maryland, estimates that there's no fewer than 50 suffrage sites. It's a little bit difficult to enumerate because you've got people's homes and which would not be necessarily publicly listed. So you've got a lot of research challenges, but no fewer than 50, probably certainly more. The only one currently listed in Maryland on the National Register, from what I understand, is Sandy Spring. So in the Sandy Spring historical, in the historic district nomination, it does reference its place as a kind of a suffrage hotspot. So of note there in terms of preservation. So there are certainly a lot of groups, there are a lot of names, there are a lot of long names, there are a lot of acronyms. There's a lot of mergers, and some of the official groups like the Maryland Women's Suffrage Association were part of local chapters of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. So bear with me as I also get through all these names and these acronyms. In 1904, the Maryland Women's Suffrage Association elected a new president, Emma Maddox Funk, who had led the Baltimore City Suffrage Club since 1898. Funk was a Baltimore native, a graduate of Eastern High School, and another just amazing historical tidbit, apparently during 2 years spent in homebound convalescence in her adolescence, she passed the time by reading suffrage literature, and when she emerged, she specifically sought out other Baltimore women engaged in the movement to get involved. One of her major achievements as the president of that organization was successfully lobbying for that national organization to bring their 1906 annual convention to Maryland. And as we now know, an incredibly important milestone in the Maryland suffrage movement, when Susan B. Anthony made one of her final public appearances, and very much a passing of the torch in this multi-generational movement. The Maryland Women's Suffrage Association had a more conservative approach than the Just Government League and their hikes, and Funk continued to pursue attempts to bring statewide suffrage legislation before the Maryland General Assembly. These measures were universally rejected by the state legislature, including in 1912, 1914, 1916. Nonetheless, Funk led the Maryland Women's Association through the passage of the 19th Amendment, carried by 36 other states, not Maryland. And after 1920, her political engagement continued as she advocated for women's rights and made 2 unsuccessful attempts in her run for office. So I've just checked my time and I've gotten excited and might be running out of time. So I want to make sure that I get to a very important player who I will unfortunately rush through, but actually is one of the suffragists of which there is a growing amount of information about, and that's Augusta Gisele. So Augusta Gisele was a civic leader in West Baltimore. She was one of those women involved with the social clubs who quickly turned to suffrage. Her neighborhood in West Baltimore was also home to the colored YWCA and YMCA, which at the time when she was living there, and then through continuation were part of Green Book sites, and was just an incredibly politically active African-American community. To learn more about Augusta Gisele, please go to Ballot Beyond. She has her own episode there, and there's a lot more information and resources about Augusta. So when did Maryland women actually get the right to vote? Well, in 1920, thanks to the National Amendment, but the Maryland legislature did not ratify the amendment until 1941 and did not certify it until 1958. And I'll let you posture why we think they did or did not do that. So again, as I started, Maryland has an incredibly complex, both some of the earliest with Margaret Brent and Still Pond, and then kind of this tarnish. So I think there isn't a way to study much history without finding things that really inspire you and things that inspire you to do more. So that's what I've learned about Maryland's suffragists in the past couple of years. I've also learned a lot of other names that, wow, I need to research. And if you go to Casey Roan's research or any of the events that are happening for the rest of this month and into the next year, we will hopefully start to see a lot more about these women and their contributions to democracy. So in saying, this is what I've learned. You can obviously tell I'm excited about it, and there's a lot more to learn. I recommend these 4 books. Harriet Tubman's biography by Dr. Kate Clifford Larson. Why? Well, Tubman was a suffragist, but I also think by reading this, I learned a lot about how social club activism happened in those times, how many letters went back and forth, and how abolition, and suffrage were also tied together. So a great foundational book. Women's Hour, Vanguard by Martha S. Jones is due out in early September, and then Baltimore specific book specifically about Victorine Q. Adams by Ida E. Jones from Morgan State, which is on my bookshelf and I've been meaning to get to. So I apologize for rushing through at the end there. If anybody's got time to hang out for questions, I'm happy to hang out. Otherwise, there's lots of resources and a growing amount of resources, so please check them out on Ballot and Beyond and any of the organizations that I've mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Megan. That was wonderful. You can put your questions in the chat box, and so we'll wait there. In the meantime, I'll ask a question if there are none. I know that the abolitionist movement was heavily influenced and spurred on by evangelical Christianity and that sort of thing. And I'm wondering, I was thinking about religion, and I'm just wondering, first off, do you know of any Jewish suffragists in Maryland? Have you come across any of that in your research? And two, just how the women's movement sort of came out of abolition, was there still a tie to religion in any way? So just
these are great questions for Casey Roan.
I'll have to find her.
So as I said, and I will, if you've signed up for this, I will, everybody on the call, if you signed up for this, I'll send Molly some information. You know, what I've called together for this presentation is definitely, I'd say just starting like onto that surface. Now, the next series of episodes that we're releasing on Ballot and Beyond went one layer deeper, relying on volunteers from the Maryland Women's Heritage Center. And I know if you can get your hands on the context report, I do hope that it goes into that. My perceptions of how religion affected it, I know that Quakers were instrumental in it. Because of my concepts of religion and how religion was in that time period, I think most of us would think people who followed a certain religion wouldn't let half the stuff that happened happen. So that's, I suppose, my more personal take on that. So I leave that to the historians and researchers to teach us that.
Wonderful. So just looking here. So someone said, can you repeat the title of the last book you referenced?
Oh, sure.
Oh, good. Yes, we can just.
Yeah, sure. We can leave it on here. So it is by Ida E. Jones, and I believe the title is The Power of the Ballot, Baltimore Civil Rights Leader Victorine Q. Adams. And something that, because I rushed through, and I apologize about Augusta Gisele, was a lot of the African-American suffrage groups remained incredibly active afterwards and provided essential resources for first-time voters. So not only was it like, you know, the woman we heard from Still Pond saying, oh, I felt silly. Well, I mean, if I didn't go voting, you know, with my parents and in the little booth, or your friends didn't do it, or you didn't talk about it with your coworkers, and you didn't all, you know, carpool to the polls, like that sort of learning of how to be a good citizen, you know, women were excluded from. So African-American women, particularly Augusta Gisele, she had a column in the Baltimore Afro-American, and their social group continued to meet to provide those like civic lessons, how to register, how to vote, what's a political platform, and really that get out to the vote education was a huge component after 1920.
Great. Okay. Let's see. Did the anti-suffrage movement hold counter-protests or marches? What was the interaction between the two groups?
So I don't have top of mind any specific Maryland examples of that happening. I went on a suffrage walking tour in DC a couple years ago, maybe 2 years ago. And I remember somebody giving, you know, the walking presentation and similar to what I did, you know, pulling from the newspapers, what were people saying? You know, terrible things that were said to women. And I don't know if you're anti-suffragist. I don't know if you're racist. I don't know if you're sexist. I don't know if you're just an unpleasant person. But certainly the level of threat, physical harm, verbal harm, certainly a great risks were taken, especially the women traveling in groups and things like that. So certainly a risk they took because they believed in their cause.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Oh, people are coming in here. Do you think the struggles surrounding the fight for the women's vote will affect turnout in this upcoming election?
I mean, I think that, so on the 19th, just a couple days ago, if you scrolled through Twitter, I mean, every single female correspondent from any national news source was talking about, the impact of the women's suffrage movement, and including the 19th Amendment hashtag. So I don't know. I mean, thinking it wouldn't have been great this year. I mean, I'm not sure. I mean, I think if you're on this webinar, share it with somebody who maybe wasn't here or wouldn't think to sign up, and to share women's suffrage as an example of a protest to better American democracy. So when I went to a couple of women's suffrage lectures, there was one man in the room who happened to be, I think, related to the presenter. So I do think that some of this history is not, it's not women's history, it's American history. And so yeah, if you can use any of this information or these tools, or it be inspired or inspire others to vote as part of this year's celebration, do so. And there are so many resources to commemorate this.
Wonderful. Well, I think that is a perfect stopping point. Thank you, Meagan, again for a terrific presentation. And
thank you for having me.
Yeah, it was just wonderful. And we hope to see everybody next week.
Yes, we'll see you there for Jillian's presentation.
Wonderful. Thanks.
Take care, everybody. Go vote.